8 islands sit off the coast of California, in plain view of millions of people every single day. Almost nobody can name them. Almost nobody knows what is actually inside them. Here's the first thing that should stop you cold. These islands were not always here. They used to sit down near San Diego, and something violent enough to rotate an entire landmass 110 degrees carried them nearly 200 miles north over millions of years. And inside a narrow crack in the rock on one of these islands, archaeologists found something considerably stranger than geology alone. Evidence that people were fishing these exact waters using technology nobody thought existed this early anywhere on the Pacific coast. Cordage. Woven baskets. Fishhooks predating anything else known by thousands of years. This is the story of a cave that quietly rewrote how the first Americans actually got here. Look at a map of the 4 northern Channel Islands, San Miguel, Santa Rosa, Santa Cruz, and Anacapa, and something about their arrangement should catch your attention almost immediately. They sit lined up in a neat east to west row, running parallel to the Santa Monica Mountains on the mainland behind them. That orientation is genuinely strange, and it is worth sitting with directly. Every other major mountain range along the entire North American coastline runs roughly north to south, tracking the general shape of the continent itself. These 4 islands do not. They cut directly across that pattern, running east to west instead, a formation geologists call the transverse ranges. And here is the detail that makes them genuinely unique. This exact orientation exists nowhere else on the entire Pacific coast of North America. For a long time, nobody could fully explain why. Geologists understood, in a general sense, that the theory of continental drift existed, but understanding that continents moved and understanding precisely how and why a specific chain of islands ended up rotated a full 90 degrees out of alignment with everything around them were 2 very different problems entirely. The answer finally came together once researchers began mapping the deep history of the Pacific Plate itself, tracing exactly when it first began grinding directly against the edge of North America. That collision, playing out over millions of years, is the same geological process responsible for creating the San Andreas Fault, one of the most significant fault lines on the entire continent. And these islands sat directly inside that collision zone the entire time. Roughly 18 million years ago, the 4 northern Channel Islands were not sitting off the coast of Santa Barbara at all. They sat considerably further south, down near San Diego. As the Pacific Plate ground steadily against North America, it did not simply push past the continent's edge cleanly. It caught pieces of the coastline directly in that friction, and slowly, over the following 18 million years, it dragged an entire chunk of landmass northward, rotating it dramatically out of its original position as it went. Picture what that actually means laid out across geological time. An entire landmass, caught directly in the grinding friction between 2 massive tectonic plates, physically rotated a full 110 degrees from its original orientation and hauled nearly 200 miles up the coast in the process. By the time that slow, violent journey finally settled, the islands that once sat near San Diego had come to rest exactly where you find them today, lined up off the coast of Santa Barbara instead, still bearing the twisted, rotated orientation that entire collision left permanently stamped into their shape. That is not a small incidental detail buried in a geology textbook somewhere. That is the origin story of the ground these islands are actually built on, violent, slow, and almost impossible to fully picture at a human scale. But here is what makes that specific violent history matter for everything that comes next in this particular story. The same tectonic forces that tore this landmass loose from the mainland and dragged it 200 miles north also happened to create something else entirely by pure accident. An island chain that would go on to become one of the most remarkable places on the entire continent for preserving the deep past, intact, layer by careful layer, for tens of thousands of years, largely undisturbed by almost everything that destroys evidence like this everywhere else. Here is a detail about these islands that sounds almost too simple to matter, right up until you actually understand what it means for anyone trying to study the deep past. The Channel Islands have no burrowing animals living on them at all. No gophers, no ground squirrels, no earthworms, no termites, nothing constantly digging, tunneling, and churning through the soil the way burrowing animals do, essentially everywhere else on the entire continent, generation after generation, year after year. Think about what that absence actually means in practice, because on the mainland, it is genuinely easy to take for granted just how much disturbance is happening constantly, right beneath your feet, almost everywhere you go. Gophers push soil upward from below. Ground squirrels dig extensive tunnel networks that mix layers together that would otherwise have stayed neatly separated. Earthworms churn through soil continuously, gradually working older material upward and newer material downward, blending everything together over time until distinct layers become genuinely difficult to tell apart with any real confidence. On the mainland, that kind of constant biological disturbance is simply the default condition almost everywhere. It happens quietly, invisibly, for centuries, and by the time an archaeologist or a geologist finally comes along to study a particular site, the layers they are looking at have often already been thoroughly mixed and disturbed, sometimes so completely that a precise, reliable timeline becomes genuinely difficult or even impossible to reconstruct with any real confidence. The Channel Islands never had that problem in the first place. Without a single burrowing animal disturbing the ground, sediment on these islands settles exactly the way sediment is naturally supposed to settle. Layer sits cleanly on top of layer, undisturbed, for thousands upon thousands of years running, each one representing its own distinct, readable slice of time, stacked directly and reliably on top of whatever came immediately before it. For an archaeologist or a geologist working a site like this, that absence of disturbance is genuinely remarkable. It turns these islands into something very close to a perfect layer cake, a precise, richly detailed record researchers can actually read with real confidence, tracing specific, measurable changes across enormous stretches of time in a way that most sites on the mainland simply cannot offer anymore. Their own equivalent records already quietly destroyed centuries ago by nothing more dramatic than ordinary, ongoing biological activity happening constantly underground. Think about the sheer scientific value that single ecological quirk actually represents. An entire island chain sitting just off one of the most densely populated coastlines in the entire country, quietly preserving an undisturbed, readable timeline stretching back tens of thousands of years, simply because the specific combination of animals capable of disturbing that record never happened to establish themselves here in the first place. And nowhere across these 8 islands does that layered, undisturbed record actually run deeper or stranger than inside one narrow crack in the rock, sitting on a remote, wind-battered stretch of coastline on the northeast side of San Miguel Island. A place easy enough to walk directly past without a second glance if you did not already know exactly what was waiting inside it, sealed away and undisturbed, for longer than most people can genuinely comprehend without actually standing there themselves. On the northeast coast of San Miguel Island, roughly 25 miles off the Santa Barbara coastline, sits a site that barely even qualifies as a cave in the way most people naturally picture one. It is a narrow fissure cut directly into the rock, roughly 11 meters long, paired with a small outer rock shelter, and fronted by a shell midden that spills gradually down the slope directly in front of both. Researchers call it Daisy Cave. It was first formally documented in 1967 and 1968 by archaeologist Charles Rozier, working through the Los Angeles County Museum of Natural History. His initial surface surveys noted prominent shell deposits scattered around the site, along with what appeared to be possible cordage fragments visible right at the cave's entrance, an early hint, even at that first glance, that something considerably more significant might be sitting underneath the surface. But here's the honest gap that sits right in the middle of this particular story. Serious, systematic excavation did not actually resume at Daisy Cave until the mid-1980s, nearly 2 decades after Rozier's original survey work first identified the site as genuinely promising. When researchers finally did return, they went back specifically to re-examine Rozier's original trench walls, carefully clearing and reopening sections that had sat essentially untouched since his initial work. And when they ran radiocarbon dating directly on shell samples pulled from those reopened trench walls, the results that came back were not remotely what anyone working the site had actually expected going in. The deposits were considerably older than anyone had previously assumed. Think about what a result like that actually does to a research team's entire understanding of a site, practically overnight. A location that had already been documented, surveyed, and generally understood to hold some genuine archaeological value suddenly revealed itself to be considerably more significant than anyone had originally given it credit for, based on nothing more than careful chemical analysis of a handful of preserved shells pulled directly from the reopened trench itself. Picture the physical reality of this specific location for a moment, because it matters enormously for understanding exactly what this discovery actually represents. A narrow crack in a windswept cliff face, sitting on a remote, difficult-to-reach stretch of a small island 25 miles offshore. The kind of place a casual visitor could walk directly past without a second glance, assuming, if they noticed it at all, that it was nothing more than an ordinary, unremarkable gap in the rock. Instead, that narrow crack was quietly holding on to one of the oldest continuously used sites documented anywhere along the entire Pacific coast of North America, an active, layered record of human presence stretching back considerably further than researchers had ever seriously considered possible for this specific stretch of coastline. And what would eventually come out of that narrow crack across the following decades of increasingly careful, methodical excavation work did not simply push an established date backward by a few centuries, the kind of modest correction that happens fairly regularly across archaeological research generally. It fundamentally rewrote what serious researchers actually believed early people living along this coast were technologically capable of accomplishing at all, this early in North American prehistory, using tools and techniques nobody had previously credited them with possessing this early in the archaeological record. The researcher who ultimately unlocked the full significance of Daisy Cave was Jon Erlandson, working carefully through the site using a meticulous, methodical technique. Rather than digging broadly across the entire deposit at once, his team excavated in tightly controlled 50 by 50 centimeter columns, removing material in careful, thin, stratigraphic layers, preserving the exact sequence each layer had originally settled in. That patient, methodical approach eventually identified at least 4 major occupation layers inside the site. Paired radiocarbon dating, run on both charcoal and marine shell samples pulled from each individual layer, produced a genuinely striking sequence of ages, roughly 700 years old at the uppermost, most recent layer. Then progressively older readings moving downward, all the way to a lower stratum suggesting activity stretching back to the very tail end of the last ice age itself. But it was 2 specific categories of recovered material that genuinely stopped researchers in their tracks and forced a real reconsideration of everything they thought they already understood about this particular stretch of coastline. The first was cordage, woven plant fiber material, recovered directly from strata dated to nearly 9,900 years old. The second was basketry, fragments of twined weaving, possibly the remains of sandals, recovered from a slightly higher layer, dated to roughly 8,600 years old. Here is why those 2 specific numbers genuinely matter, and why they deserve real attention rather than simply being filed away as one more interesting statistic. Those 2 finds effectively doubled the previously established age of known woven technology anywhere along the entire Pacific coast of North America in a single stroke. Not a modest correction of a few centuries. A genuine doubling of the established timeline based directly on physical, testable evidence pulled straight out of the ground. And the cordage and basketry were far from the only significant material recovered from those same early layers. Researchers also found shell fishhooks alongside finely worked chipped stone tools, bifaces shaped with real skill and precision, evidence of a genuinely sophisticated maritime toolkit rather than a scattered, opportunistic collection of whatever happened to be lying around. Think carefully about what that specific combination of evidence actually reveals about the people who left it behind. This was not a small, desperate group huddled at the very edge of survival, making do with whatever crude materials happened to be immediately at hand. This was a population who had already worked out in real demonstrable detail how to build seaworthy boats capable of reaching this island in the first place, how to weave functional cordage and basketry, and how to fish these specific waters skillfully and consistently thousands of years before anyone studying this coastline had previously assumed that level of genuine maritime sophistication actually existed here. That is a considerably different picture than the one most people carry in their heads when they picture early coastal populations struggling to survive along an unfamiliar shoreline. This was skilled, deliberate, technically accomplished work, sealed away and perfectly preserved inside a narrow crack in the rock for nearly 10,000 years, waiting patiently for the right combination of careful excavation and modern radiocarbon dating to finally reveal exactly what had actually been happening on this remote stretch of coastline, far earlier than anyone had seriously considered possible. And Daisy Cave, remarkable as this entire record already was entirely on its own, was not the only place across these 8 islands quietly proving that people had arrived and thrived considerably earlier than researchers had ever previously assumed. In 1959, an archaeologist named Phil Orr was out on Santa Rosa Island working on something that had nothing directly to do with archaeology at all. He was building a road across Arlington Canyon, driving his Jeep across difficult, uneven terrain, when the vehicle got mired down completely in the mud, forcing him and his team to climb out and start working to free it. While Orr was standing there working to extricate his own stuck Jeep, he happened to look up. Sticking directly out of the canyon wall, exposed by the same erosion that had made the ground so difficult to cross in the first place, was a human femur. Orr and his team stopped everything immediately. Working carefully, they began scraping away the surrounding sediment, exposing the full profile of the bone to confirm exactly what they were actually looking at. What they eventually uncovered was not one femur, but 2, both protruding directly from the sidewall of Arlington Canyon, buried 37 feet below the existing ground surface. Even in 1959, working with the geological knowledge already available to him, Orr understood enough about the deep alluvial layers on Santa Rosa Island to recognize immediately that these bones were sitting considerably further back in time than an ordinary, casual discovery. Radiocarbon dating technology, still relatively new at that point, could not yet pin down a fully precise age. But Orr knew enough to secure funding and bring some of the leading archaeologists of his era out to the island directly to properly examine and document exactly what he had actually found. Decades later, Orr's eventual successor at the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History returned to those same remains, this time armed with considerably more advanced radiocarbon dating techniques than had existed back in 1959. The updated results were genuinely remarkable, roughly 13,000 years old, making these remains the earliest confirmed adult human bones ever found anywhere in North America. Think carefully about what a result like that actually means, laid out plainly. A human body, that old, found sitting on an island, is not a small or incidental detail easily set aside. These islands, even accounting for the considerably lower sea levels present during the height of the last ice age, were never once connected to the mainland by any land bridge. Reaching Santa Rosa Island at any point in its history has always required deliberately crossing open water. That means whoever this person actually was had to have traveled here by boat, at a time period considerably earlier than the traditional land bridge-only model of American migration had ever comfortably allowed for. Now place that single discovery directly alongside everything already established at Daisy Cave, the early cordage, the woven basketry, the sophisticated fishhooks, and worked stone tools. Taken together, both pieces of evidence point unmistakably in exactly the same direction. These were genuinely capable seafaring people, moving steadily down the Pacific coastline by boat, considerably earlier and considerably more skillfully than the old story of a single interior land bridge, walked slowly by foot traffic alone, had ever properly accounted for. 2 separate islands, 2 entirely independent discoveries made decades apart by different researchers working completely different sites. And both of them, once the dust from the initial digging finally settled, were quietly pointing toward the exact same conclusion about who actually reached this coastline first, and precisely how they managed to get here at all. Before this story closes, it is worth understanding one more piece of what these islands preserved. This time not in stone tools or human bone, but in the animals that lived and eventually vanished, alongside the people who arrived here. Sometime around 20,000 years ago, at the height of the last ice age, Mammoths roamed freely across the larger landmass that once combined Santa Rosa, Santa Cruz, Anacapa, and San Miguel into a single connected island. Researchers believe these were originally full-sized Columbian mammoths, animals capable swimmers by nature, the same way modern elephants have been documented swimming distances well over 20 miles in open water. Stranded here, generation after generation, isolated on a landmass with genuinely limited resources compared to the mainland, those mammoths gradually evolved into something considerably smaller. The pygmy mammoth, a genuine, distinct species found nowhere else on Earth. And here is the detail that connects this animal story directly back to everything already established about the people who eventually arrived here. The pygmy mammoth disappeared from the fossil record at almost exactly the same window when Native American populations first show up on these same islands. Centuries later, that same deep pattern of isolation played out again, this time in a genuinely human story, considerably more recent and considerably more heartbreaking. In 1835, missionaries relocated the Nicoleño people living on San Nicolas Island to the mainland. But in the chaos of that relocation, one woman was left behind entirely, either forgotten in the confusion or unable to be located before the ship departed. She survived completely alone on that island for 18 years, until a hunting expedition led by George Nidever finally found her in 1853. Think about what 18 years of complete isolation actually demands from a single human being. No other voice, no other face, just the island itself, and whatever she was able to build and maintain entirely on her own for the better part of 2 full decades. Among the sacred places she would have known intimately during those 18 years is a painted sea cave. Locals still call the Cave of the Whales, a site sitting right at the ocean's edge that visitors today consistently describe as genuinely overwhelming to actually stand inside, connected directly to the animal spirits and traditions her own people had maintained there for generations before her. Her story does not end gently. Brought to the mainland, after her rescue, she fell seriously ill almost immediately, her body unable to handle a rich, unfamiliar diet after 18 years of survival on considerably simpler resources. She died within 6 weeks of reaching the mission, her real life eventually becoming the foundation, generations later, for the novel Island of the Blue Dolphins. Stand back now and look at everything these islands actually held together, layer upon undisturbed layer. A landmass physically torn loose from the mainland and dragged 200 miles north by tectonic forces. A narrow crack in the rock holding cordage and fishhooks that quietly doubled what anyone believed early Pacific Coast people were capable of building. A canyon wall holding the oldest confirmed human remains anywhere in North America. And finally, a woman who survived entirely alone for 18 years, in a place her own people have never stopped remembering, long after everyone else assumed she was already gone. These islands were never simply a silhouette on the horizon waiting to be noticed. They are a landmass torn loose from the California coast and dragged 200 miles by the same forces that built the San Andreas Fault, preserved almost perfectly by an accident of ecology, since no burrowing animal ever disturbed the record underneath. Inside one narrow crack in the rock, that record held cordage, baskets, and fishhooks that quietly doubled what anyone believed early Pacific Coast people were capable of building. 37 feet down a canyon wall, it held the oldest human being ever confirmed in North America. And on the water, at the edge of it all, it held a woman who survived completely alone for 18 years in a place still sacred to the people whose ancestors never stopped remembering her. Subscribe for the next investigation.